The Korean War is one of the longest wars to date and is still technically going on. We all know the political aspect of it, the communist scare, the nuclear missiles in the democratic South. However, one thing during the war is not touched on a lot. What was the citizens' life like prior to the ceasefire during all the fighting? As you may know, there was a lot of back and forth fighting, and that may have led to lots of problems in the life of Korean citizens during the time. In this documentary, we will be exploring the experiences and hardships of the South Korean citizens during the Korean War. Prior to the war, South Korean citizens lived a normal life. I lived in a big single house in Seoul, which is now the capital of South Korea. I lived with my 6 siblings and grandparents. And while I went to school, my father worked on the railroads and my mother was a housewife. No one really thought about communism prior to the war, said my great uncle. The Korean War began on the 25th of June, 1950, when the North crossed the 38th parallel and started firing. Within an hour, North Korean forces were lined up on the 38th parallel and started to attack. At that point, most people's lives spiraled out of control. People who were fit were sent to war, women and children stayed home. The capital of South Korea, Seoul, exchanged hands 4 times. Seoul was the center place for so many destructive battles that most of it in surrounding areas were eradicated. Families were forced out of their homes and soldiers were forced to run in order not to be captured by the North Korean army. At the time, my great uncle was home when he heard of the war. He himself had to run further south to avoid capture and lived on the streets. His most vivid memory of the war was when Chinese troops invaded his hometown and started shooting at people. The first fight he was involved in was in a city called Gyeongsang-do Andong. He said, "I was so scared and was shaking so hard I initially couldn't even fire my gun." He would then travel 1 day north of Seoul into North Korea. That would be all the fighting he would endure. He goes on to say that the whole time he thought about his family. He lost them very early into the war and was not reunited with them until 1951, a year after the start of the war. He wants people to remember 2 things. 1, that it was the North Koreans who started the war, and even though there were a lot of relationship building in the news, you still cannot trust them. Many citizens' educational lives and futures were ruined because of the war. My great uncle was lucky enough to get a high school level education prior to the war. Before he had to go serve, he said, "I wanted to be a businessman because they were regarded as pretty high ranking in the professional industry." During and sometime after the war, though, he lived on the streets, dead broke as a beggar. Due to the destruction the war caused, he managed to make a living as a construction worker. Even then, it was very difficult to make good money, just because of how economically and infrastructurally damaged Korea was. This wasn't exclusive for one city either. This occurred both in the entire North and South. Due to many Korean citizens being forced to run from their northerners, most people left with nothing except the clothes on their back. Anybody who didn't run from the invading communists was either forced to fight or killed. Life after the war wasn't exactly easy either for most Korean citizens. A lot of the South Korean citizens immigrated to America where it was easier to make a living. But only the citizens with certain sets of skills could immigrate. Families and unskilled people were left behind until a skilled person could have them come live with them. My great uncle was lucky enough to land a job at an upholstery store where his boss made his life fairly easy. The citizens who stayed in Korea most likely had a promising job, not to say that life there was easy. It took many long, hard years to reshape South Korea and return it to its former glory. South Korean citizens, though, made it out easy. The North Korean citizens are still impoverished and starving to this day under a communist dictator.